Hi, thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Margy Avery, Acquisitions Editor at Trinity University Press. Right now, things are looking pretty end of the world like. What happens when nuclear bombs, religious visions, disappearing glaciers, and political shifts rock nations and edge us beyond science fiction and into reality? Trinity University Press, we're glad to host this conversation, The End of the World as We Know It, the Nonfiction of Apocalypse, an evening with writers Beth Peterson and Matt Donovan, talking about writing into apocalyptic subjects and in apocalyptic times. Beth Peterson is an assistant professor of writing at Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Her essays and poetries have appeared and are forthcoming in Fourth Genre, River Teeth, Post Road, and the Mid-American Review. She's been a finalist for the Nonfiction Collection Book Prize, the Autumn House Press Nonfiction Book Contest, and the Cleveland State Poetry Center Essay Collection Competition. She has an MFA in Creative Writing from University of Wyoming and a PhD in Literature and Creative Writing from University of Missouri. Dispatches from the End of Ice is her first book here at Trinity University Press. Matt Donovan, our other writer here, is the author of two poetry collections, Rapture and The Big Bam, which is from Tupelo Press in 2017, and Vellum from Mariner in 2007, as well as a book of lyric essays, A Cloud of Unusual Size and Shape, Meditations on Ruin and Redemption from Trinity University Press. A new collection of poems, The Dug Up Gun Museum, will be published by BOA Editions in 2022. Donovan is the recipient of a Whiting Award, a Rome Prize in Literature, a Creative Capital Grant, and an NEA Fellowship in Literature. He is currently the director of the Boutel Day Poetry Center at Smith College. So for this evening, we're going to have a reading from both of our writers here, and then we will take some questions that we've thought about, and we will take some questions from the audience. So if you want to ask your questions on the chat feature, that's the great place to do it. And just a quick plug for the books, if you want to, you can get a 20% discount for both of these books right now using the discount code. It's The End of the World at tupress.org. So let's start with Beth Peterson.
Hey, thanks so much for hosting this reading and for coming. So great to have you. So, and I've really enjoyed reading Matt's book as well and seeing the connections between our work as I've read. So I'm going to read a little bit from an essay called Lost and Inventory. And I'm just going to read you some sections from it. So it's set up as an inventory, as you might expect. So in 2013, approximately $300,000 worth of jewels were found in a small metal box marked Made in India that was halfway buried, halfway sticking out of the thick, icy crust of a glacial peak on France's Mount Blanc. The tin box was about the size of a shoebox. The jewels inside it included emeralds, rubies, and sapphires, roughly 100 stones in total. The box of jewels was discovered by a 20-year-old French student and mountaineer. When he found the box, he immediately carried it down the mountain to the nearest police station. The jewels could have been worth millions for all he knew, but he said he would give them to a museum if no one could claim them and was entitled to the find. It turns out, though, that the jewels weren't random or lacking an owner. They had been carried across Europe, from Pompei to Delhi to Geneva en route to London by Air India Flight 101. A flight that on January 4th, 1966, crashed into the Bassans Glacier on Mount Blanc at 15,584 feet, killing the flight's crew and all its passengers. The jewels had been there ever since. According to the online etymology dictionary, the words lost and loss can be traced back to the Old English losian, which means to perish or destroy. The similar root word loose spread from Norway and meant there the breaking up of an army. I tried to see Mount Blanc one summer. I'm going to Switzerland for a couple of weeks and plan to fly through France, take a train across the country, and visit the French Alps before I make my way to the Swiss mountains. The week before I go to buy my tickets, though, terror attacks take place in Paris, and so I end up buying a direct flight to Zurich instead. A couple days before I leave for the trip, I explained to my friend David that I'm sad to miss Mont Blanc. Just a second, he says, disappearing upstairs. He emerges a minute later with a map of Switzerland. The map is colorful, bright blues and greens with mountains and towns illustrated in their approximate locations. There, that's the spot, he says, pointing to the Swiss mountain Schilthorn. You can see Mont Blanc from that pass in Switzerland. I look at the spot where he's pointing. Mont Blanc is labeled in tiny letters on the map, surrounded by a deep blue sky. If Air India Flight 101 had flown 15 meters higher, it would have missed the edge of Mont Blanc entirely. After the crash, it was determined that a communication error led to the plane hitting rather than missing the mountain. The air traffic controller told the pilot to descend after Mont Blanc. The pilot seemed to think that he had already passed the mountain. The plane flying Air India 101 was a Boeing 707-437. It was named Kanchenjunga after the third highest mountain in the world, an Indian peak that's said to be the home of the Valley of Immortality. On December 11, 2009, a friend of a friend, Katie Nolan, and her climbing partner, Anthony Viette, go missing. They're not in Switzerland, but instead on Oregon's Mount Hood. I watch the news daily, hoping for their return, but no news comes. I remember meeting Katie on a snowy day in northern Wisconsin. I remember the evergreens all around us, the small lodge nearby, how she looked at all the snow around us and gave me the advice, don't forget to breathe. 8 months after they went missing, Katie and Anthony's bodies are recovered, hanging on the edge of Mount Hood's Reed Glacier, once the warmer weather has melted the snow enough to see them there, suspended in time. My friend Kim and I go to Mount Hood. I want to see for myself where they've gone. It's early summer. On the day of our hike, we're supposed to be making a loop towards Mount Hood. The shady uphill path moves us that way at first. After 30 or 40 minutes, we can see the mountain ahead of us, its snowy outline looming against the trees. I take a photograph of Kim and myself on the mountain. We're wind-whipped and my face is red from the hike, but the sky is clear behind me. We turn just after that onto a high ridge that veers back into the denser woods. Perhaps that's where we go wrong. After only a few minutes, instead of continuing to walk up towards the mountain, we seem to be going down. We walk and walk some more, and I feel certain this must just be a dip before a rise, but there is no rise. When we finally turn around and walk back, we can't find the path up from our map. Somewhere near the lowest part of our descent, I hear 3 sharp blasts of a whistle, as if someone is calling for help. But in the dense trees, I don't know where the whistle is coming from. I cannot make my way to it. In 1300, the word lost came to mean wasted or ruined or spent in vain. By 1500, it also took up the meaning gone astray. In the 1630s, the phrase to lose one's heart emerged to mean falling in love. In 1744, the phrase lose heart began to refer to discouragement. In the summer of 2017, the summer I visit Switzerland, the President of the United States declares that he will be withdrawing the country from the Paris Climate Accord. As someone who cares deeply about the environment, which I do, he says in his official statement, I cannot in good conscience support a deal that punishes the United States, which is what it does. Within 6 weeks of that announcement, an iceberg the size of Delaware breaks off the Larsen C Antarctic ice shelf. 4 months after that, the United States suffers Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Irma, and the most significant California wildfires then in its history. 5 months after that, the Environmental Protection Agency pulls 3 of its scientists set to talk on climate change from the lineup of a Rhode Island conference. 5 or 6 days into my trip to Switzerland, I make it to Schilthorn. I want to see Mont Blanc, if only from a distance, and so I take a series of cable cars up the mountain. The first cars are packed, standing room only, but more and more people get off at each stop until it's only me and a small group of Australian students in the last car. As I exit the final cable car, the air is noticeably cooler and thinner, a dramatic change from the early summer heat below. I put on my jacket and walk around. There are a handful of people in the viewing area, but beyond us, almost all I can see is mountains, a billow of overlapping crags, some shadowed by valleys and highways of snow, sharp angles of barren rock on others, becoming hundreds of meters below evergreen forested slopes. I walk along the edge of the platform. There are signs detailing which mountains can be seen in each direction. The sky is clear in all directions except for one. A low hanging cloud obscures from view a single mountain in the distance, Mont Blanc. The nearest I come that summer to Mont Blanc is taking a photo in the airport at a store named after the mountain. I assume when I walk down the terminal gate towards the store that it will be an outdoors shop. It turns out it sells diamonds. One summer, I visit my friend Laura, who has recently gotten married and moved to Europe. She and her husband Andrew take me to country pubs and an old forest. We have a picnic in a meadow. The day I arrived, they picked me up from a small train station in a medium-sized city, the city where Andrew grew up. Would you like to have a tour, he asks, and I nod. We wander by shops and restaurants, through a garden, past a river, and then he points to the city's cathedral. We should go inside, Laura says, and grabs my arm. We walk right past the paying entrance. Andrew doesn't believe in paying to visit churches, she says, as we push open the side door and walk through. We wander around the cathedral, past its long wooden pews, cement plaques, tombs for famous people who were buried in that spot. After a few minutes of walking around, and while Laura and Andrew are looking at a tomb and discussing some historical figure, I walk to the very front of the church, to a narrow hallway behind the lectern and communion table and seats for the priests. There's a wooden door and it's open. I'm not sure what this place is for, or even if I'm supposed to be there. I step inside. Inside the room is a small chapel filled with paintings in woodcut frames, each painting of a different Christian saint. My eye is drawn to a single painting though. There's greenery around the saint. He has wispy brown hair, wears a cloak, and is carrying a long wooden staff, still bearing the marks where it was sawn off when it was once a tree branch. A small nameplate below the painting reads, St. Christopher. A woman standing just behind me looks to the painting and says to her husband, he's the saint of lost things, isn't he? No, her husband replies, reading off a small yellow cardstock brochure that he has in his hand, something he likely picked up from the information table in the corner. He's the saint of travelers, the man finishes, and mountaineers. He once carried the Christ child across a river. Though I'm not of a tradition that venerates saints, in that chapel, my friends waiting just outside, I kiss my palm and touch the saint's head. The real saint of lost things is Saint Anthony. One time, tradition says, he prayed for a lost book to be returned to him, and it was. He also had the gift of preaching. One day, years before he preached to crowds of thousands, there was no one there to listen, and so he went out by himself and preached his message to a river teeming full of fish. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Beth. That was lovely. Can you all? Am I on now? I'm not seeing myself. So okay, great. Thank you so much, Beth, for that lovely reading, and I want to thank Margy and Bergen for organizing the event tonight, and to all of you out there in Zoomland, wherever this is reaching you. Thank you so much for making time for the reading tonight, and yeah, it's a total pleasure to read with Beth this evening, and I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to read from just excerpts of one of my essays from this book from Trinity University Press, A Cloud of Unusual Size and Shape. The title of that book comes from a description of Pliny the Younger's eyewitness account of the eruption of Vesuvius, the eruption in 79 AD that destroyed the ancient city of Pompeii. And there's 6 essays in the book that focus on a different home that was excavated in Pompeii. And the essay I'm going to read tonight, the portions of it are dealing with the body casts of Pompeii, which are probably the best known aspects of Pompeii, and perhaps the most memorable for those of you who have been there, or even if you haven't been there, it's likely the most photographed part of it. So they're the body casts of the, well, I hope the process is explained in this essay a little bit of what those casts are, and that's part of what I wanted to meditate on here. So the essay is called Garden of the Fugitives, which is a site where they discovered a number of these hollows where people had been, and they filled with plaster, and that process is described here. So, Garden of the Fugitives. There were always more of the dead to find, as well as what the dead had carried. This time, in the villa of Diomedes, when they discovered the skeletons of 18 adults and 2 children, they found not only a wooden casket and a string of blue stones, a hairpin and vase, wine still sealed and amphorae, 31 silver coins, 44 bronze coins, 4 finger rings, and a candelabrum, but also, preserved within the hardened ash, the precise contours of where someone's flesh had been, an arm, a bit of shoulder, the curve of a breast, a sliver of someone's back. What to do next was unclear. The process of making these body casts in Pompeii is well known and in theory quite simple. It's even spelled out in one of my son's step into reading books, titled rather dramatically, Pompeii, Buried Alive. At first, the scientists found only a few skeletons, the book reads. Then they saw strange holes in the hard ashes. They poured plaster into the holes. When the plaster dried, the plaster casts were shaped just like people. Such straightforward syntax belies our faith in acts of resurrection. And that last exclamation point, a form of punctuation sprinkled throughout the book, underscores our ongoing fascination with the victims of Vesuvius. In an article for National Geographic, former Pompeii superintendent Amadeo Mari, discussing those iconographic plaster forms, bettered even the hocus-pocus swiftness depicted in my son's book by chalking up the site's safeguarding of body shapes to the work of some belatedly sympathetic divine force. It was as if, Mari claimed, nature wished to reward them with their efforts by memorializing their figures. Needless to say, the formation of those casts was far from instantaneous. First, the preservation of those century-old body shapes required precise chemical and geological conditions within the volcanic ash. Then, before the hardened layers of debris being excavated were hauled away, workers at the site had to be trained to recognize the subtle signs, such as a small depression in the earth that might indicate a void below. After carefully probing the ash deposit and making incisions intended to facilitate the plaster's flow, after the cavity was painstakingly cleaned and the plaster carefully channeled in, and after waiting 3 days before tapping and brushing away the caked ash clinging to the now hardened form, then, and only then, might something body-like be revealed. But not always. The archaeologists couldn't always be sure what the nature of the void they were tending to, and thus there was no telling what the earth would give back. Sometimes, hoping for a human form, those working at the site were offered instead, say, a couch cushion, long disintegrated in a cavity that retained its cushion shape. Instead of a bicep, there might be a door or 3 wooden stairs, or a windowsill in splintered bits. What they summoned back from among the long gone might be an ex-slave fish sauce merchant, or perhaps 2 legs of a wingback chair. In the photograph, the cast is on its back, arms splayed at its chest as if clawing the air. Because the plaster is still rough-edged, or perhaps didn't fully form to the shape of the man's head, it gives off the appearance of a zombie-like skull stabbed onto a still hatching body. This is the kind of terror-inducing figure that haunted my wife's dreams when she first visited the site as a 5-year-old. Once, she swears the family needed to take shelter from a sudden hailstorm, and ducking into the ruins of a home, found themselves sharing the space with a white, childlike shape lurking in a corner. She remembers waking in the night in her Pompei hotel, knowing that the bodies were close by, perhaps shambling through the ancient streets. My wife's fears and fascinations are by no means unique. For many visitors to Pompeii, the plaster casts of the victims are the most memorable thing encountered in the ancient city. Yet, despite this allure, there's surprisingly little explanatory information about the bodies at the site. And instead of signs directing you to specific locations, tourists more frequently simply happen upon the far-flung plaster forms. You'll find them in a storage facility just off the Forum, or in a dilapidated back room at the Villa of the Mysteries. Near the Nocera Gate, at the end of a lawn lined with cypress and umbrella pines, and next to what looks like a tool shed, there are several cracked and rain-pelted bodies. The first time I toured Pompeii, I stared at every plaster shape I came across, expecting to experience something in the way of sorrow or shock or even a quick jolt of the heebie-jeebies. I felt nothing. Although they remained untouched in the same patch of earth for nearly 2,000 years, the dead are no longer afforded any singular, unchanging, euphemistic, final resting place. Once their forms are excavated, all bets are off. Some of them have been transferred from the locations where they were found at Pompeii's Central Forum, where in a building resembling nothing so much as a hardware store's garden center storeroom, they've been given a new home among the clutter of amphorae and marble and crates. One cast, dubbed the Multier by archaeologists and the Crouching Man by tourists, was apparently first found not far from the gymnasium latrines. Now, across town, surrounded by the triple stacked shelves of pottery and pillars, he squats on a white painted wooden box. One alcove over, next to dozens of stacked plastic crates, there's the plaster cast of a woman face down in a rust-flecked aquarium-like case. In front of her, there's what looks like a marble bird bath collecting euro coins pitched through the metal bars. Without any provided explanatory signs, who or what is the novice tourist supposed to think these forms are? Not that the site's rare accompanying text, even when it can be found, affords much of a foothold either. The so-called Garden of the Fugitives, for instance, is one of the very few places within the archaeological site that provides background information regarding the displayed casts. Close to a surprisingly chic glass display case, perhaps 20 feet in length, above a wooden fence and tangle of grapevines, there's a bilingual sign that explains, if not the body casting procedure, then at least some broad strokes regarding these victims, as well as the appropriate emotional response of the gazing tourists. And this is what the sign says. The large green space was used as a vegetable garden and vineyard with some olive and fruit trees. In the layer of ash, the cavities of 13 human bodies were found. Adults, young people, and children from various family groups who had desperately tried to flee under the rain of ash. The contrast between the dramatic tangle of the casts of the poor victims and the tranquil beauty of the flourishing countryside is an emotional experience for the visitor. Despite being instructed on what to feel, I found myself instead wondering if it was too early in the morning to offer a lollipop bribe to our already dawdling son. I was thinking that while the sign had it right about the beauty of the countryside, there was no dramatic tangle of bodies on display. Rather, as a means of facilitating viewing, there was an arranged procession of equidistant casts. And I was weighing the extent to which these Pompeii bodies jab a stick in the spokes of that Christian funeral mantra. These lives didn't cycle from ashes to ashes, dust to dust, but rather from ashes to dust, buried in ashes, to a body-shaped absence, to plaster. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Beth, for reading. So I haven't received any questions from the audience yet, which I'm sure they'll be typing some in soon. So let's start with a question, unless one of you has something that you would like to add first.
I'll just say that one of the pleasures of preparing for tonight was seeing some of the serendipitous connections between my book and Beth's. That was a real pleasure to see. So I think there's structural correspondences and some of the fragmentation that we both employ. But for instance, we're probably the only two people in the last 60 years that have quoted from that or mentioned that same children's book about Pompeii. So I cheered when I came across that in your book, Beth. I think I mentioned to you. So
yeah, I love that too. The step into reading. I thought, I can't believe we've both written about this step into reading book. So yeah, that was lovely.
As a step into reading topic, but
yeah, nothing teaches reading better than apocalypse and asphyxiation.
That's right.
Well, speaking of the apocalyptic, how did you all both come into your topics of writing? Of what I know, Beth, can you say a little bit about what brought you to the somewhat dramatic turn of events or events that sort of stacked up for this?
Yeah, great question. So in terms of the book, I ended up living near a disappearing glacier in Norway, and so that's how I came to writing the book. As I started seeing this really quickly receding landscape, and then while I was there, I had a professor named Craig Arnold that disappeared while he was hiking a volcano, actually, and that hence the volcano connection with Matt. And so it was a bizarre kind of era for me of trying to figure out what's going on. So I was seeing all these disappearances and trying to make sense of them. So that's kind of how I turned to the apocalyptic in some ways. But I think I'm pretty interested in the apocalyptic as a literary genre because I think it actually, I've heard Duke professor Portier Young talk about it as like pulling back the veil on reality. That's what the apocalyptic does best, is it shows us some reality that we've missed. So I think that was something that was kind of in my mind as I was writing the book.
Beth is selling her experiences a little short, as well as these disappearances. She also, a climbing friend also disappeared, falling off of a mountain during a climb. And Beth herself almost disappeared as she fell into an ice crevasse. And as I was talking about this book with people when we were working on it, and then Beth went to the glacier museum, and it burned down the night before she got there. It's a alarming set of events, but
yeah, you might want to be careful if you're like my traveling partner or my friend. Like there are some definite disappearances that seem to be happening. So yeah. For sure, it was a big series of disappearances or near disappearances.
Matt, how did you end up with Pompeii?
So I had written my first book of poetry, and a lot of those poems deal with the kind of allure of violence and how form can be found in violence, and so I had wanted to move away from that subject altogether. And I had a fellowship that took me to Rome for a year. So I actually made a plan that I was going to write a series of lyric essays connected to haikus, Japanese haikus, which was an amateur move. It turns out when you get to Rome, that's not what you want to write about at all. And so they had, I think, every book in the English language, and I mean, obviously in Italian too, but I mean, every resource I could imagine on Pompeii right there, including, that we were a train ride away from being in Pompeii. And I kind of stumbled on it by accident, but went hard down that rabbit hole and was in the process of writing about it. And it is an infinitely fascinating place. And I was interested in the structure too, that idea of the names of these houses that form the chapter titles of my essay. So, it's like, House of the Large Fountain, so I was interested in that house structure as a kind of metaphor. So I had this idea for this larger sequence of lyric essays connected to Pompeii. And it wasn't until I was, I don't know, probably like on essay 4 when I realized I'm just writing about the same kind of fascination over and over, like it's another vessel for the same obsession, which was such an obvious thought, but I'm a very slow study when it comes to my own writing. So it took me a long time to even recognize that it was yet another manifestation of this theme that I've always had this allure to. And then it certainly was, again, helpful to have, experts on Pompeii that I could sort of lean on and, just research at my fingertips there. So that's the kind of genesis of that sequence of essays.
Interesting. Speaking of forum, we have a question that has come in from our audience, and this is posed specifically to Beth, but I think this is a question that's applicable to the reading aloud versus of reading on paper. But so this is from Betsy Weinrich asking, Beth, I know this piece came from your book. The way it read, it did not sound like an inventory. How is the chapter shaped and why is it that way?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in the actual chapter, I have list items, which I deleted in the reading here, just because it read a little bit smoother without the list items. But I did use an inventory, and I to come back to Matt's book too, I really enjoyed how we both were working with the lyric essay form, because I think the form is so interesting, because in the lyric essay form, structure speaks to content. Structure is content always. And so in mine, each of the chapters have some sort of lyric form, whether they're a book or ice disappearing into water or a math equation. So there's some kind of obvious hermit crab structures. But I can let Matt talk about his book too, but I do see that kind of the lyric moves, the fragmentation and juxtaposition, associative thinking, working in both of our books pretty similarly. And so I found it a useful way to think about ice and ice's disappearance. And also I kind of thought of my book as this sort of set of artifacts. So each essay is a different artifact. But.
Oh, that's super interesting. Yeah. I really like the question too. And again, it was one of the things that I really enjoyed about Beth's book. I think it can be, maybe that's a strange thing to say, but in terms of how my mind works, it feels like a more honest way of writing, if that makes sense. That so like as I was listening to Beth's reading, I was thinking about the ways in which you're employing things like etymologies and personal histories and political narrative, and suddenly a leap to the saints, and it's wonderful to track how all those things come together. But I feel like that's in part how my mind works. I have an essay in the book called Monkey Mind, where I feel like I am constantly leaping to other thoughts and then also forming meaning from those juxtapositions. So some of it is, hopefully something that's compelling for the reader, the ways in which these kind of threads can be braided together. But it also is a way for me to make sense of these things. Like I actually need to carve out space on the page to, again, poetry is my background. So in the nonfiction, it's like a stanza shape. It's a room where I can just sort of spotlight, say, an etymology, and meditate on that, and then use that as a stepping stone to the next thought. And generate content and meaning out of that. And when I say honest too, I guess just to quickly say, I don't feel like I have a resolved thought about a lot of what I'm writing about. And so the fragmented form actually seems like, I don't know, more truthful to me. Like it corresponds more to how I am left unresolved with these things. I can't follow a linear strain, and there's no like set conclusion.
Yeah, I agree. I like that, Matt. I mean, I think the lyric essay is more participatory because it's asking the reader to make meaning with you, because I think the meanings aren't easy in a lot of these topics. And so with these complicated meanings, we're asking the reader to pull a little bit more weight and say, hey, what do you make of this? Let me give you these experiences and ideas and facts and histories. And instead of me reflecting and saying, hey, this is what it means, I'm going to give you the possibility of, reflection yourself. So, yeah.
We have follow-up question from Bessie then about the inventory, and which I think will leads to another question that I'll ask after. Does taking an inventory counteract the feeling of loss or define the loss? And this, I think, can lead into our question of how does using the lyric essay help you approach a giant global issue in a way that doesn't overwhelm yourself or readers and make them just check out because it's so massive and impossible to handle?
Yeah, I can jump in there. Thanks. Great question. I think in inventory does give some distance from loss. And I think that's sometimes what essayists do, maybe a little bit differently than memoirists. I mean, both Matt and I are writing essays. But to the second question, I think that the essayist always has to localize the global. My students and I talk about that phrase a lot. So taking a big global issue and making it feel local. And that can happen through a narrative, it can happen through history, it can happen through myth. It can happen through helping a reader fall in love with a place so they care about it. But I think when you have these big issues like climate change or nuclear bombs, you have to help the reader find a way in, because I think the temptation for all of us is just to shut down because there's so many big things happening all the time. And so I always say to my students, we have to localize it and so that the reader cares. And sometimes that localizing is actually making a connection to a local place too. So in the end of my book, I'm writing about flooding and I mention a bunch of cities. And I remember a journal picked it up and they said, do you really need this many cities? And I thought, I actually do, because I want people that are in various places to see like, oh, this could be me. This is possible where I live too, that I could be flooded because of climate change. So, yeah.
I love the answer, and I love the way that question is phrased too. So yeah, thank you for that, Betsy. I would just maybe springboard off of what Beth is saying. So your question reminds me of this line I came across in a poem recently by Rick Barrett, which is "Research is mourning," and where he's taking inventory of all these things that have been that were once on this ship, and so it is both a way to commemorate and allow it to reverberate in a personal level, but in the act of listing all those things, it is an act of elegy. It's compounding the sense of loss. It's both of those things at the same time. So just to tie it into an answer into my essay too, for me, it was, and connected to what Beth was saying too about personalizing it. I think hopefully when we're writing about the apocalypse, hopefully one of the things we're trying to do is bring the reader to a place where an act of empathy is possible, right? And so I think it's very easy with those plaster casts to just pose next to them and use them as sort of like a tourist destination, but there were lives lost. And just because they're lives of antiquity doesn't mean that they're not, that we shouldn't have an empathetic response. And in terms of categorizing them, for me, it was really important in other parts of that essay to describe some of the personal details that differentiated those plaster casts. So it could be like a broken sandal strap, or in some of the casts, the plaster process was so precise that they actually could see the shape of the pubic hair, for instance. And so like that became an opportunity to humanize the dead, which hopefully is what that's about as well, what this whole process is about, of writing about it.
I just wanted to add, this is on Matt's book, but one of my favorite parts of the book is, which I think you did read, is where your wife finds herself, she's scared because she finds herself in a room with these plaster casts in a storm. And I feel like that, in terms of creating empathy, it suddenly is like, oh, you're really with the dead, in this room stuck, and kind of fear. So I think that's a really strong moment. Well,
can I know we want to move on to another question, but the one thing I want to say too about something from Beth's book is, we're talking about humanizing the dead, but I feel like another important part of this engagement is humanizing the speaker in these essays. And I think it's really important, some of this, Beth, I don't know how much of this you're consciously using as a strategy, but I I love it in a nonfiction piece when there's a voice of authority that's able to convey the right information, and then they also make mistakes, that they are infinitely fallible, right? So like to not know how to respond or to get lost, as you do in some of your pieces, the speaker gets lost, to make mistakes, to make errors, to get on the wrong train, and include that, because that for me, it humanizes the speaker, and for me, it solidifies a sense of trust as well. And I don't know, this also speaks to the fragmentation, I think. Like, I don't want things totally wrapped up, and I don't want there to be, every act of nonfiction or every act of writing nonfiction, I think, is a construction by definition. But then at the same time, I don't want to get a sense of that self being merely a veneer of a speaker too. It seems so important to conveying, the material, that there's a human being on the other end of it.
So this is so that's giving the space for readers to draw their own conclusions and not and make figure their own feelings is something that is, I think, Mark's lyric essay and the work that you all are doing. But there are, what are the ethics of writing about the apocalyptic? There are lines that you would draw, or for instance, right?
I guess I'll jump in. It's a big question. I would say, Beth, and I'll be so curious to hear what you have to say about this, but I would say overall that the ethics about writing about the apocalypse are not that different from the ethics connected to any act of nonfiction. So I do think, I do hope that the effort of the writer is not to sensationalize, but to actually engage. And so ultimately, again, there's that hope for empathy on the other side of it. But then I also think, and just to go back to that moment of being honest, I do find it troubling, that idea of, you can see them online, all these photos, for instance, of tourists, posing next to the statues, the casts of Pompeii with a big thumbs up, right? And so that shows a fundamental disconnect of human engagement and emotion. But at the same time, I don't think it's honest, and thus it's not ethical for me as the writer to pretend to merely finger point there, right? So I think it's important to say that, yes, I was trying to engage with this material. And then meanwhile, I also was with my 6-year-old, and it turns out Pompeii is huge with really uneven roads, and it's hard to walk around. And so that became part of the ethics, became to put my own inability to sustain engagement in conversation there as well, to admit to my own complicity.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I think that's a really important piece. I think for me, in terms of writing, I always, and this is just a general writing ethic, again, not necessarily an apocalypse ethic, but I want my writing to be invitational rather than fencing people out. So I feel like that's something in terms of the ethics of writing apocalypse. So, we're writing about real apocalyptic subjects. Climate change is real, and it's upon us. And so I want people to feel invited to learn and think and to see. Same with nuclear bombs. These are big, huge subjects. But I think that, I would say that I think some writing, maybe perhaps because of the position of the narrator that maybe Matt's talking about, as not being that narrator that says, oh, I'm kind of above all of this, transgressions, or I'm above, difficulty, that fences people out, instead of inviting them in to see oh, okay, this is a real human way to approach these big subjects, not to sensationalize them, but to think about them. And I think that's why the essays are a really good form for writing about apocalyptic subjects, because it's not sensational. The essay, it's history, it's science, it's a little bit of narrative, it's all of these things. And so in many ways, it's kind of the opposite of sensational. And so the essay is taking the reader on a journey of thinking. It's a journey of thought, as opposed to a journey of just emotion. And so I think that helps keep the writing from becoming sensational.
I think that's such a stark difference between the fiction writing about the apocalypse and how that often that's much more of fetishization of the violence and the gore and whatnot. But how do you have any thoughts on the differences in between fiction and nonfiction writing about the apocalyptic, or your experience as a reader, or?
Well, I would say, I mean, I read a lot of Victorian fiction, so I go way back. Mostly, I don't read too much contemporary apocalyptic fiction. So I think about, like, I have in my book, Journey to the Center of the World, the Jules Verne, which is sort of apocalyptic. And, I think about H.G. Wells and some of these other writers. But I appreciate their approach to it, in that their approach is thinking, it's not, they're thinking through these big issues, like what really is at the center, and what does it mean to mind that? And it's very metaphorical. But yeah, I would say, I mean, I don't read a lot of contemporary apocalyptic fiction. I don't know. How about you, Matt? Maybe I'll pass that question off.
Well, I mean, the example from my book, this is slightly different than fiction, although it is fictionalized. The first essay that I have about Pompeii in the book talks about that made-for-TV movie that came out in 1983, The Day After, right? Which is very, maybe not sensationalistic isn't the word, but it certainly was about fear-mongering, and it certainly was about, just putting our faces right in it. And it is sensationalistic as a gesture. But that movie came out, I think, when I was 10 years old. It was assigned to us as homework. We had to watch it. Our parents didn't want us to see it. And I was so thrilled that it was assigned to us. And so I can't, this goes back to the idea of complicity. That part of that essay for me is all about recognizing the allure of that. I mean, we were out of our skins with excitement, and at the bus stop the next day, it was tantalizing, sensationalistic material that was, meant to be received as such, in addition to the fear mongering. So, I don't know if that gets to your question, but I mean, just to pivot on that, I hope that one of the needs of the nonfiction writer is to, enact that pivot, or at least somehow enact the possibility of the pivot. And just to, going back to the ethics, I hope self-reflection becomes a part of it too, right? So to self-reflect on my own rubbernecking that I was doing as a kid there and how troubling that is, but also to admit to the allure of ruin there in that moment. But I think I'm thinking about a book like Station 11, or Cormac McCarthy's The Road, where, I mean, those are two examples that just come to mind where, well, with The Road, with Cormac McCarthy, maybe it's a little bit more complicated to put into this conversation, but Station 11, where, that's a book that is certainly about, it's set in a post-apocalyptic world, right? But it's definitely about humanizing those characters and having the kind of nuance of, the explorations that can come out of the roving Shakespeare troupe, and how meaning can be generated, still in those moments, despite the ruin that we are victims of, we're in the midst of.
So your previous book, Matt, was obviously, you were writing about events in the past, and Beth's is dealing with very contemporary events that we're living through. But your next book is dealing with more events in the present. And how has that changed your approach to? Or do you want to say a little bit about the book or the project, or? Sure.
I'll read one of the poems from it at the end of the evening. But the book is called, as you mentioned at the start of the evening, The Dug Up Gun Museum. It won't be out for a couple of years still, but it's a book that came out of what I thought was going to be a literary journalism project connected to guns in this country. So I was someone, I didn't know a lot about guns. I probably still don't know a lot about guns, but as someone who's deeply concerned about gun violence, I finally decided that I needed to start having conversations with people. So there's an example of the ethics too, right? Not just be sitting back and saying guns are bad and take all the guns away, but actually what started that project was to go out and put boots on the ground and actually meet people and ask questions. And for me, the most gratifying isn't the right word, but for me, the moment where I knew, or I thought I knew that I might be onto something that I would want to write about is when I had my own stereotypes flung back at me, so moments where my own assumptions, might get thrown back at me, and I would realize how, I would realize my assumptions, and I would realize how many stereotypes were, clanging around in my head as I thought about this topic. And it was really important to have those conversations. So I went to places like Cody, Wyoming, where everyone I met had a gun, to go to places like Sandy Hook, to Chicago and Cleveland. And so, some of what I'm talking about are mass shootings, but some of what I'm talking about are, urban gun violence. And I tried to just talk to people. And I think, again, going back to the ethics, there were moments where I wanted to be sure that I put myself into those pieces, and my own mistakes in there. It seemed really important to own those mistakes, whatever they might be. And then there are other moments where it was all about trying to get the hell out of the way, and realizing that anything that I would do or say here would be intrusive and problematic in terms of the trauma of the person that was telling me about someone who had died, who was a victim of gun violence. So one of the difficulties that I ran into with that was, just trying to think about, how, and this is maybe a way to transition to Beth's thinking on this, but how do you get people to engage, to read about this kind of deeply complex, but also trying topic, so for instance, as I was shopping the book around, one of the things that an editor said to me is, and this was over the summer, people have urgency fatigue, so everyone was admitting that, guns in this country are an urgent issue. And then this is happening during an election year when there's a pandemic going on and an ongoing environmental crisis. Do we really want, which I also sympathize with. I can't say that, there haven't been moments during this pandemic where I haven't wanted to just, watch some cooking show on Netflix, rather than, engage with some of these topics, that there's a pacing of oneself. So I don't know, Beth, is that, you're in your book, you're dealing with much more, contemporary pressing environmental issues. Are these considerations something that you were actively considering even as the book was formulating?
Yeah, good question. It certainly was something that was on my mind as the book was coming together. It wasn't on my mind when I first went to Norway, so I didn't expect to kind of fall into this project. But then once I did, I became really, moved by what was happening, and I felt like, oh, this is urgent, and how can I help engage readers so that they feel the urgency of it? But I think I understand what you're saying in terms of the pandemic and gun violence and the election. And I think there is a fatigue right now. And it's hard to know what to do with that exactly. I think we write into our own things that, that we care about, and we keep writing. I think that's what writers do, is we keep writing. But let's hope there won't be a pandemic forever. I hope that some of the urgency fatigue will wear out at some point. But I think, I talk a lot with my students about giving ourselves grace for this too, because this is an unprecedented event. And so it's okay I was just telling one of my students yesterday, it's okay to not write. So, if you want to watch the Great British Baking Show instead of writing for a while, it's all right. That's fine. And you'll write again. But yeah, I think it's good to stay engaged and stay connected, wherever and however you're staying engaged and connected, as long as it's healthy and helpful for you, I guess I would say. But.
So I just want to make sure we have enough time for the last readings that you all wanted to do. And Beth, do you want to start us off again? Or
sure, yeah. I'm just going to read a really short section, this is just a section about memory and remembering. So I read this a few different times. I was writing an essay about cairns, which are like stones of remembrance. It comes later in my book. It used to be the last essay of the book, but it got moved around a little bit. But I think a lot about what does it mean to remember what matters. So, all right, so that's the beginning of this. So when I was a child, my father used to read me a story about cairns. They weren't called cairns, but I realize now that's what they were. A young boy and girl in that story were tasked with finding a lost prince who was buried underground under a witch's enchantment. To save the prince and the world itself from the witch's evil schemes, the children must remember 4 landmarks, 4 signs that they've been given. Watching for an old friend who can help them along their journey, finding a ruined city of giants, seeing a message written in stone and following its instructions, and knowing the lost prince by a phrase that he says. The children at the end of the story do discover the lost prince, but only after significant lapses of memory where their own desires, sharp smells of food, and bright invitations by the cunning witch, and even trying to be helpful strangers make the lights of their memory seem dim and hazy. The signs are not quite what the children thought they might look like, and it becomes tiring at points to continually recite them. The story was fitting for my father and I to read, both of us having the worst memories in our family, forgetting places, sometimes the events of whole weeks or summer vacations. For some reason, the story of the boy and girl mattered in a way that the other stories did not. I thought often about that boy and girl and what had been required of them in order to find the prince and save the kingdom. Long after the book was over, late at night, lying awake in bed, I'd ask myself, if I were one of those children, would I have seen the signs? So that's it.
I love that chapter in your book. I'm really glad you read that. Yeah, it's beautiful. And I will read one of the poems connected to guns in this country. The link here to our theme for the night, there's definitely an aspect of this poem that relates to the allure of ruin. I think that'll be clear when it gets there. And the connection to the apocalyptic is, this is definitely a poem about the polarization of America and gun violence. I realized too, I kind of set myself up in this piece because, and how I was talking about this book before. So this is a poem where I am very aware that the speaker here is not engaging in the right way. So, for those of you keeping track of my hypocrisy out there, I understand how the speaker is also very problematic here and not having the kind of dialogue that I just said would take place here. And I'm not sure there's anything. Oh, there's mention of school buses here. And I don't know if you all remember what school buses are, but there are these magical large vehicles that used to take our children away from us and bring them back educated and leave us alone for a little while. I hope they come back one day, but there are school buses mentioned here. So this is called Fake News Bus Stop Prayer. Although most mornings we only talk about whether it feels like snow or just allow the silence to grow between us while our kids whip the air with willow branches, making wide Z's with 3 quick strokes. Today, Indigo's dad, Pat, was on a tear, fired up after ABC News aired a report called Slaughter in Syria, and by mistake used footage from a Kentucky machine gun shoot, an event we learned he attends every year in order to unleash full automatic fire into dishwashers rigged with propane tanks. There are things to say, all of them better than what I managed in the moment, which was a few muttered words intended to derail his fake news rant and pull all of us gathered at the end of Orchard Drive back from the brink of needing to respond to rage we didn't share. Neighbor Pat, from within the absolute silence of this page, I'll confess I hope never again to hear you describe what it's like to spray bullets into refrigerators, speedboats, barrels of fuel. And yet, who am I to pretend to know nothing of the pleasure of ruin, especially after the Tri-County Fair, where I forked over a few extra bucks in order for my family to watch the school bus smash-up derby, where my sticky blue wristband proclaimed yes to the wreckage, to wincing and mock groans, yes to a hymn of broken glass, where the point was good riddance, and to see our look both ways world shattered, to stalk and batter and T-bone some chump, then back up and floor it again. To bellow, yeah, baby, as my Oliver did, cheering even louder when the number 19 caught fire, its flames lapping across the hood, making the air horn blare its mournful timeout cry, so that the firemen could trudge in from the sidelines without much urgency, as if phoning it in, as if saying, this shit happens all the time. See, Pat, whom I barely know, whom I've twice seen wearing a gun control means using both hands t-shirt, I could do better by you. If I wanted to rummage for some paltry common ground, I'm guessing we both could agree too much shit happens all the time, that our sidelines are empty of anyone ready to step in, and that another form of fake news is pretending you are the you in a poem you'll never read. This morning, post-bus stop drop-off, it's worth remembering that we both hate that guy who once gunned his Beamer past the school bus, and neither of us believe prayer or poetry or any other word for casting words into silence is sufficient to keep us safe. Maybe we could admit we share more than weather, wreckage, daily farewells. Each afternoon, we stand together on one scrappy length of grass until the school bus returns at 3:25 on the dot, and that one kid in the back seat either mimes little pistol shots at my face or flaps her little wrists in a gesture of goodbye, mixed with an attempt at flight, as Lori, the driver, unfolds her sign, flashing her all's well thumbs up that means not just have at it, but goes stumble racing, backpacks jostling across the asphalt in a madcap joy relief. Neighbor Pat, I know I'll never share any of this with you, but for what it's worth, tomorrow, I swear, I want to mention at least half of the two-line benediction I found on the Machine Gun Range's website, thanks to you. It begins, the shoot takes place, rain or shine, and ends, the good Lord willing, the creek doesn't rise. And that is my election prayer.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Beth, for spending this hour with us. And thank you all for spending this hour with us, because I know there's many other Zoom opportunities out there for you at this time, vying for your attention. So thank you for choosing to spend this with us. For our next Zoom event will be about elephants. It's called Elephants We Hardly Knew You. And this is for the launching of our new book about elephants, 33 ways of looking at an elephant by Beth Peterson. So elephants are the planet's greatest land animals, arguably, are fast declining in numbers and could be gone by the end of the century. Will we miss them? I think that's a rhetorical question, yes. What would their disappearance mean to us? In celebration of the new anthology by Beth Peterson, who wrote the definitive biography of Jane Goodall and also co-authored many of her books with her. This is Dale's book about elephants. So please join ecologist Carl Safina, Felicia Nutter, and Alan Rutberg of Tufts University Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine as they consider popular conceptions and misconceptions, ancient and traditional lore, scientific knowledge, and the reality of elephant minds and emotions. So this will be on Tuesday, November 17th at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. So register now at tupress.org. Event registrants will receive a code for 20% off the purchase of the book, with a portion of the proceeds supporting the Tufts Elephant Conservation Alliance. And again, you can also get a 20% discount off of Beth and Matt's books, which you really I urge you to pick up and to check out. And that discount code is End of the World, appropriately. So this brings us to the end of our reading and our hour. Thank you all again for joining us, and hopefully we will see you at another apocalyptic topic about elephants.